Hello and welcome to another video from the only source of information that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's video is the third installment in the Melchizedek video series. And in this particular video, I will be revealing just who Melchizedek is. In parts 1 and 2 of this series, I explained in no uncertain terms that according to the Bible, Abram was born 60 years earlier than the church's claim, and that when he was born, all of his ancestors were still alive, including Noah, the builder of the ark. Since religious people hate truth and love lies, there is no possibility that any of them are going to use this information to increase their understanding of God's Word, the Bible. It is more likely that they will simply continue doing as they always have, treating this essential Bible truth as inconsequential. I can promise you that it is not. Over time, civilizations, religions have created a fiction that each and every one of us has come to accept as truth without even being aware of it. We have all come to accept that the Bible is a collection of, for the most part, unrelated stories designed to teach us basic life lessons, when in fact, that is not the case at all. The Bible is a single, unified story about mankind's struggle to overcome God's natural law. The core theme of the Bible is the war between God's kingdom and Satan's empire. These vital truths, which under normal circumstances would be self-evident, have been hidden from mankind for thousands of years by the hierarchical, demonic system known earthwide as religion. We can learn a great deal about how the churches have been able to accomplish this as we unravel the mystery surrounding the identity of Melchizedek. Once you become aware of this one simple method that the churches use to confuse mankind, you will be much better equipped to recognize other lies that you may currently be unaware of. Many events take place in the book of Genesis. Just a few examples. From chapter 5 to chapter 20 would be the birth of what many English Bibles call Nephilim, or giants, associated with the ruining of the earth. God bringing a global deluge. Noah getting drunk and sinning. Nimrod building a tower, and the languages of mankind becoming confused. Abram being called out of Ur to travel to the promised land. A great war beginning with the death of a man named Peleg, and Abram's meeting with the rightful king, referred to in our Bibles as Melchizedek. To the average person, these incidents are called Bible stories, plural. Breaking up the Bible into individual unrelated events is not without purpose. Separating these parts of the Bible into individual stories is much more insidious than someone might think. As children, we are exposed to Bible stories on TV and are given Bible story books as part of the process of learning to read. As adults, we hear these stories in church. A preacher might get up in front of his worshipers and speak in great detail about the Tower of Babel. He may even give some kind of explanation of what that story means for us today. At some other time, he may choose to speak of how Jesus will be a king and a priest in the manner of Melchizedek. But you will never hear any representative of any of the empire's religions speaking in any way that would allow someone to figure out that these two stories, as well as the others, are part of a single event. Doing so would, without a doubt, lead to revealing precious Bible truths which could potentially weaken religion's hold on God's children. The Bible does not go into great detail about every aspect of life immediately following the flood. But we do know that up until the birth of Abram, Not a single death had been recorded following the flood. In fact, the very first mention of death after the flood was the death of Peleg, which took place when Abram was 48 years old. The death of Peleg is much more significant than any of the cults of Christianity, Judaism, or Islam want you to know. I'm now going to be speaking about some seemingly unimportant dates and events that at first might sound boring and confusing, but when I am done, I will put the whole story together so that you can go back and confirm for yourself that everything that I am telling you today is accurate. You will probably be shocked that your pastor, preacher, priest, rabbi, or imam never told you the truth about these precious Bible teachings. It is also very likely that you will rejoice that after years of being lied to, you can now confidently walk away from whichever religion it is that has been manipulating you into ignorance. The Bible records very detailed information about the timing of events in the ancient past. However, that information was written down long before our modern Anno Domini calendar was created. Since there is no way for us to know for certain when events from the ancient past took place according to our modern calendars, it would be best if we study this information using the ancient Anno Mundi calendar. I have already explained how that calendar worked in the previous video. We're not told of exactly when Noah's grandson Nimrod began to build cities. In fact, we don't even know when Nimrod was born or when he died. But we do know that he was Noah's great-grandson. So as a contemporary of Noah's other great-grandson, Salah, who lived from 1693 a.m. to 2126 a.m., we can expect that Nimrod would have lived at roughly the same time as Salah. Although not precise, this information gives us a good basis for determining the general timing for the construction and fall of Babel. We know that Abram met with Melchizedek in the Promised Land. And we also know that Abram did not leave Ur to travel to the Promised Land until he was 75 years old, meaning that his meeting with Melchizedek would have to have taken place sometime between 2023 and 2123 a.m. The meeting between Abram and Melchizedek took place after Abram ended a war between the kings from the east and the kings residing within the Promised Land that had descended from Canaan. The Bible makes a point of telling us that immediately after the flood, the earth was for the most part united, and that this was the situation for quite some time. The details of the life and death of Abraham's great-great-great-grandfather reveal another clue to determining when this era of peace officially ended and when the meeting between Abraham and Melchizedek took place. As the Bible says at Genesis chapter 10 and verse 25, Eber had a son that was named Peleg, because in his days the earth became divided. The Hebrew word Peleg means irrigation canal, and is indicative of the division brought about by such a water feature. Peleg lived from 1757 to 1956 a.m. The war that Abraham participated in could not have taken place prior to the birth of Peleg in 1757 a.m., but most likely would have taken place at the end of Peleg's life in 1956 a.m. When Peleg died, he was 239 years old. As old as that might seem today, at the time it was exceptionally young. As I said earlier, the Bible does not record the dates of every birth and death of everyone involved, but of those that are recorded, none had ever died as young as Peleg. In fact, prior to the death of Peleg, the shortest natural lifespan of anyone that had ever lived was that of Noah's father Lamech at 777 years old. That means that Peleg's lifespan was 538 years shorter than any other human that had ever lived, with the exception of Enoch, who God took prematurely. It is an undeniable fact that Peleg had to have died some kind of unnatural, violent death. If we take into consideration that Peleg was named as a result of the war, we can safely assume that he got his name by being an especially significant casualty of that war, perhaps the first. Were we to give this war a name, it would not be wrong to call it the War of Peleg. A major event spoken of as part of this Bible account is reported to have taken place in the land to the east when people miraculously lost the ability to communicate with one another. Genesis 11 and verse 9 says, "Because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth." That means that for a certainty, we can say that the exodus from Babylon would have taken place sometime between 1757 a.m. and 1956 a.m. Since this account includes the table of nations as found at chapter 10 of Genesis, we can expect that every single family line mentioned was somehow involved when these events began to take place. The Bible did not record the births and deaths of everyone on the list, so we can assume that the dates that are recorded are the only ones that are important to understanding the chronology of the story. Even for me, it is quite difficult to keep the story straight in my head. I had to carefully document every date and event mentioned in the Bible on a chart that is available on the website. It will make the story much easier to understand if you follow along on the chart while I am describing the details of this account. It may be even easier to understand if you listen to the whole story all the way through and then go back and follow along with the chart afterwards. After the flood, humanity began to settle into a relatively small area of the earth called Shinar, which means land of two rivers. These two rivers are the Tigris and Euphrates. The entire area would eventually become known as the Babylonian Empire. According to Genesis chapter 10 and verse 9, the first human ruler to rebel against Noah was his great-grandson Nimrod, who is called a mighty hunter in the sight of Yahweh. In our English Bibles, we are told that the languages became confused at Babel. And later in the Bible, we are told that the Jews were conquered and taken into captivity in Babylon. The distinction between Babel and Babylon only exists in translations of the Bible. In the original Hebrew text, the names of the two are identical. The distinction made by the churches is false. Babel is Babylon. In 1948 a.m., Abram was born there in a world that was united. Everyone spoke the same language, and no one had ever died since the time of the flood. When Abram was 48 years old, his great-great-great-grandfather Peleg died what would have been an untimely death, likely as the first victim of the war that would disrupt Abram's life. 10 years after Peleg's death, Noah died. It was at this time that Abram was called to go to a strange land. Abram's tribe was called the Hebrews after his great-great-great-great-grandfather Eber, whose name means from the land beyond. Eber was Peleg's father. It is very likely that Babylon fell and the languages of mankind were confused in 2006 a.m., the very same year that Noah died. In fact, from the way that the account is worded in the ancient Hebrew language, it seems more than likely that the death of Noah was the actual event that triggered the confusion of the languages. The scriptures support this assumption, and there are no scriptures that contradict it. To this day, linguists acknowledge that all of man's languages can be divided into three primary branches: Hamitic, Semitic, and Aryan. These divisions follow the same pattern spoken of in the table of nations found in Genesis chapter 10. Hamitic languages are spoken by the peoples who descended from Ham. Semitic languages are spoken by the peoples who descended from Shem. And Aryan languages are spoken by the peoples that descended from Japheth. Obviously, those who study languages were influenced by the Babylon story and its association with the table of nations. That in no way detracts from the fact that 3,500 years ago, while travel and communication were still extremely primitive, the Bible accurately recorded the origin and dispersion of every language spoken on this planet, and the three primary branches of those languages. Linguists did not use the Bible account of the confusion of languages as a pattern for creating some kind of fiction. The differences and similarities that exist between the language of man are very real. The patterns that linguists associate with the three major divisions of the languages are very easy to perceive, even by those of us who are not trained to do so. Abram left Ur in 2023. It is obvious that the languages of man had already been confused prior to his entering the Promised Land, because the names of the kings involved in the war were not the same languages or the same language as that of Abram. When Abram was called out of Ur, he was not the only one that took flight. In fact, the Promised Land was not his first stop. As recorded, it is difficult to understand exactly what Abram was doing, but it seems as if he traveled around the outskirts of the land of Canaan for quite some time before finally making his way to Egypt, hundreds of miles past Canaan to the southwest, only stopping on the outskirts of the Promised Land to make camp twice. It is possible that Abraham chose his route as a means of circumventing the war. According to the account, Abram's migration was motivated by a famine in the land. When he arrived in Egypt, he encountered a people ruled over by a man called Pharaoh. The details of how these people had ended up in Egypt are not revealed, but it is likely that the death of Noah, the confusion of the languages, the famine in Canaan, and the ensuing war drove them all to migrate at about the same time. In other words, the Egyptians probably didn't arrive in Egypt much earlier than Abram and Sarai, perhaps at the same exact time. This account can be found at Genesis 11, 9, and 12, too. In any case, Abraham did eventually make the Promised Land his home, but we have no way of knowing exactly when. He left Ur when he was 75. But a lot of things happened between the time he left Ur and the time he finally settled in Canaan. This war took place in the very ancient past, which would explain why the kings Amraphel, Arioch, and Kedor-Laomer have names of uncertain origin. Many cultures from the ancient past no longer exist. Being so short-lived, it is likely that the nations that these particular kings represented did not have time to leave any trace of their languages in written form. According to Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 1, which was written hundreds of years later, Abram did not just defeat these kings, he completely exterminated them. Without political leaders or a military, and probably without even any remaining men, these people likely ceased to exist as nations and were absorbed by the surrounding nations very early in human history. The kings that Abram rescued were no better than the kings that Abram rescued them from. Even though the 5 kings of the Promised Land likely owed their lives to Abram, they still demanded that he give back their human property. As 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 7 indicates, Lot did not wish to be returned to Sodom, but apparently the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela were every bit as vile as the kings that Abraham had exterminated. Genesis chapter 14 and verse 4 explains in human terms why the kings from Shinar were so obsessed with hunting down the kings of the promised land. For 12 years, they had served Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year, they rebelled. Apparently, Kedorlaomer was Nimrod's successor, in line to become his successor, or he was attempting to take that position by force. Nimrod's reputation for hunting was likely based on his prowess as a hunter of humans. The Bible clearly indicates that Kedorlaomer was in the promised land, engaging in the same behavior that had made Nimrod famous. Both Nimrod and Kedorlaomer, just like those who rule the world in our day, were engaged in the great contest that world rulers use to determine who is the most powerful man alive. The hunting, capturing, and killing of human beings is and always has been civilization's way of determining the winner in mankind's quest for world domination. Since Bera of Sodom demanded that Abram return Lot and the other people that he had rescued, Bera was very obviously a hunter of men as well. Since the death of Peleg, mankind has never once experienced so much as a single day of peace. Even on the days when no shots have been fired in any of the government's officially declared war, soldiers have always been busy preparing for the combat that their rulers are scheming for the following day. Even the violent deaths brought about by civilian combatants, such as the deaths caused by armed robbery, drug deals gone bad, murders committed by jealous lovers, and every other murder, whether sanctioned by the rulers of the nations or not, would qualify as combat deaths according to Bible standards. The Bible uses the same ancient word to describe both government-sanctioned combat deaths and death caused by criminal activity. Even though mankind has a way of naming different parts of this war as if they are different wars, it should be more than obvious that every soldier ever sent out to fight has been participating in the very same war. It is Peleg's war that continues to rage on to this very day. Chronologically, the 12-year period in which the kings of the Promised Land would have served the kings of Shinar would have to have occurred sometime after the death of Peleg, but prior to Abraham's migration into Canaan. Abram wandered around the Promised Land for an extended time, perhaps for the entire 12 years leading up to the rebellion. When the languages became confused at Genesis chapter 11 and verse 9, and the people fled from the east to spread across the face of the earth, those who assumed power at Noah's death probably felt that they had the right to enslave any nation that was unable to defend itself, just as Earth's current world rulers feel today. It is obvious from the account that many powerful wicked men were taking advantage of the death of Noah in their bids for world domination. When Abram met Melchizedek at the valley of Sheva, he acknowledged Melchizedek's position as rightful king by bestowing upon him a tenth of what he had taken in the war. The illegitimate kings were there as well, but instead of making offerings to Melchizedek as Abraham had done, Bera of Sodom demanded that Abram make offerings to him as well. Since Melchizedek means rightful king, the demands of these other kings would have been extremely disrespectful, not just to Melchizedek, but to our Creator as well. Another thing to keep in mind is that Noah's other sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were still alive at the time of this meeting and likely in attendance. Shortly after the meeting between Abram and Melchizedek, God chose to exterminate all of the kings of the Promised Land personally, along with all of their supporters. Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim were all completely wiped out when God rained down fire and brimstone, destroying everyone and everything associated with those cities. The only city that took part in the war to be spared was Bela, because as the Bible says, they were insignificant. The name of Bela, which means destruction, was changed to Zoar, which means insignificant. This information can be found at Genesis chapter 14 and verse 8. It is likely that the nation of Bela was not concerned with world domination, but simply doing as commanded by Bera, the king of Sodom. It is also likely that after Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, Zoar submitted itself to Melchizedek's rule. Even in our day, hundreds of nations that are too militarily weak to defend themselves have chosen to enter into alliances with more powerful nations as a survival strategy. In 2047 AM, God changed Abram's name, which in Hebrew means exalted father, to Abraham, which is made up of the Hebrew word Ab, meaning father, and Raham, which is from an unknown language, perhaps meaning population. This information can be found at Genesis chapter 17 and verse 5. Abraham's name change is not as dramatic as other name changes recorded in the Bible. Both names mean basically the same thing, just in different languages. If Abraham was just intended to be the father of the Hebrews, his name would have remained in Hebrew. His title of Father Abraham was indicative of an honor involving more than just the Hebrew nation. As part of the incident involving the birth of Canaan, Noah, at Genesis chapter 9 and verse 26, declared, "Praise be to Yahweh, the God of Shem." This statement, declaring Shem's relationship with God to be somehow different from that of his brothers, mirrors similar statements that would be made by Abraham when speaking of Isaac, and Isaac when speaking of Jacob. As Jacob approached his death, he prophesied about each of his sons. At Genesis chapter 49 and verses 8 through 10, Jacob declared that the ruler's staff would not depart from Judah. Throughout the Bible, there are many such statements made about members of this family line. As time progressed, this line would produce David's father, Jesse, King David himself, and eventually David's descendant, Joseph, who was thought to be the father of Jesus. Each person on this list would qualify as the recipient of what the Bible consistently refers to as the promise. But very few would actually receive it. Prior to the death of Noah, no one would have received it. As the very obvious father of everyone alive on the earth, there would be no need to replace Noah. As long as he remained alive, he would be the head of the family. The land that would be under the control of Noah would be the entire planet. Peleg died in 1996 AM, and Noah didn't die until 10 years later. The thirst for power in and of itself is insane. However, when we take into consideration that this war was very likely begun while Noah was still alive, we have to assume that wicked spirit forces had to have been involved. Every human on earth would have known Noah and known about Noah's close relationship with God. Everyone would have known that he was their oldest ancestor and that he was the builder of the ark, which brought all living things through the flood. Just as Eve had been fooled by Satan hundreds of years earlier, those political leaders were again being fooled by Satan in Abraham's day. Not only that, but the soldiers and citizens that supported that system of unnatural governance would also have to have been under the influence of Satan as well. No other explanation would warrant such wicked behavior. Satan's promise to the first woman that she could be just like the gods is still the only possible explanation for why any human being would lust after political power. After the flood, humans still crave the political power that Satan had offered to Eve before the flood. It is a commonly held belief of religious people that God brought the flood as a means of ridding the world of evil. But according to the Bible, Noah's life before the flood was not much different than his life after the flood. The evil that he experienced in the later years of his life would not have been much different than the evil that led up to the building of the ark. When Noah did eventually die, natural law, according to commandment number 5, to honor your father and mother, would still be the only hierarchical structure that God approved of. But since no living person would have been the recognized father of everyone alive, natural law would no longer be possible. A suitable replacement would have to be chosen by God himself. Genesis chapter 9 and verse 26 indicates that of the 3 sons of Noah that were born prior to the flood, Shem's relationship with God was somehow unique. Shem is the only son of Noah on the list of ancestors leading up to the births of Joseph and Mary, the adoptive father and biological mother of Jesus. And although the promise of receiving the inheritance or possession is held out to each and every one of us, those on the list are spoken of as receiving both in a unique way. When Noah died, Shem was 448 years old. Shem, as the son in line for the inheritance, would, according to the laws of that time, have been the possessor of the inheritance for the remainder of his life, which would have ended 152 years later. As a recognized legal possessor of the land, the one in line for the inheritance, the only one of Noah's sons listed among those chosen as Noah's replacement, there can be no doubt that it was only Shem who would have been in line for the inheritance. Shem would be the recipient of the promise, but also the one called the inheritor of the land. This is not the only time in history when a replacement had to be chosen for the recognized head of the human family. After Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden, the next important event to take place involved their 2 sons, Cain and Abel. We are told that the 2 had appeared before the entrance in order to make offerings. Cain's offering was rejected, while that of his brother was accepted. Out of jealousy, Cain killed Abel. Several verses later, Eve gives birth to another son by Adam and calls his name Seth. This information can be found at Genesis chapter 4 and verse 25. In Hebrew, Seth means the same thing as our English word set, as in set in place. When Eve declared that God had given her a replacement for Abel, calling his name Seth, she was in effect declaring that Seth had been set in place as the heir apparent of Adam. In Egyptian mythology, the name of the god Set is believed to have been pronounced Seth. It is likely that the stories about the Egyptian god Set were based on the real-life human child of Adam and Eve. If you look at the chart on the website, you can confirm this for yourself. Adam died at the age of 930. His son Seth, although not the oldest male offspring of Adam, was next in line for the inheritance, Cain having been rejected by God and Abel having been killed. Seth lived for 112 years after Adam's death. Another line of reasoning for coming to this conclusion is based on something that was told to Abraham at Genesis chapter 12 and verse 7. I will give this land to your seed as an inheritance. Later, Moses was told that God had made this same promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But at these particular verses, Abraham is not told that the land would be given to him as an inheritance. This information has not been hidden by the churches. There have been great theological debates about whether or not Abraham himself ever possessed the land. There are, in fact, verses that very clearly state that the land was given to Abraham, such as the ones at Genesis chapter 13 and verse 15 and chapter 17 verse 8. But in the original languages, that is not the case at all. Such verses would be more accurately rendered in ways such as this. I will give this land to your offspring because of you. Or, I will give you this land for your offspring. In any case, these verses, just like many others that seem to contradict one another, do not contradict one another as originally written. Abraham personally was not to be the one that would inherit the land. If we look once again at the chart that is posted on the website, it is very clear that Abraham could never inherit the land because when he died in 2123 AM, his ancestors Eber and Shem were still alive. According to natural law, Abraham could not become the tribal leader of the land while his ancestor Shem and later Eber occupied those positions of authority. Abraham, unlike those obsessed with world domination, very obviously would have been obedient to the natural law to honor his father and mother. At Shem's death, Eber would have been next in line for the inheritance. But 29 years later, he too would be dead, meaning that at the death of Eber, none of the men on the list of Abraham's ancestors would be left alive. At Eber's death, Isaac would become the oldest living male member of the tribe that was included on the list found at Genesis chapter 11. So now you know why it was Isaac who received the inheritance and not his father Abraham. Abraham was never the oldest living male member of the tribe. According to recognized tribal law, Abraham did not live long enough to inherit the land, but true to God's word, Isaac, Abraham's seed, would. It is a popular misconception that the prophecy about Abraham's seed inheriting the land would be fulfilled by the nation of Israel, and that according to God's law, they would possess the land in perpetuity. It is true that there are verses that seem to support this belief. In fact, when granting the land to the nation at Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 8, Moses specifically associated the promise made to Abraham with their entry into the land. Apparently, the belief that the nation of Israel itself fulfilled the promise made to Abraham was a common misconception even in the first century. At Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16, Paul addressed this false belief. The promise to Abraham was not made to seeds, plural, but to the seed, singular, as in your seed, the Christ. It should be obvious that each and every man that Jesus descended from would have been the inheritor of the seed. Since each of those men was a member of the family that we today think of as the nation of Israel, or later as the Jews, it makes perfect sense that each of those men would have lived in that land of their inheritance with their extended families. Another reason that so many people would have benefited from that original promise of an inheritance would have been the fact that the promise originated with Shem. If we look at the details, we can see a pattern that cannot be denied. According to the Bible, The area that God promised to Abraham encompassed all of the land between the Nile and the Euphrates. That would be a huge area of the earth, an area extending all the way from Egypt to Babylon. Genesis chapter 15 and verse 18 records the details of God's covenant with Abraham. In the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land from the land of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. If we read the entire Bible without any kind of Zionist agenda, we will see that in fact all of Abraham's descendants ended up settling in this vast stretch of land. Abraham had at least 8 named children and likely many more. The only descendants of Abraham that settled in what we today consider to be the Promised Land are the descendants of Jacob, the son of Isaac, also known as Israel. Jacob was just one of Abraham's many, many grandchildren, but he is the one that was recipient of the promise. The others ended up settling in the surrounding area. When Israel eventually settled in the land, the promise that God made with the Israelites was very similar to the one that he had made with Abraham hundreds of years earlier. But unlike the promise made to Abraham, this one would involve a much smaller parcel of land. Exodus chapter 23 and verse 31 describes it this way. I shall set your borders from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, to the wilderness and to the river. For I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. Most modern Bibles have inserted the word Euphrates into this verse. However, there is no scriptural support for doing such a thing whatsoever. In the original Hebrew copies of the text, the river is left unnamed. Since the only river ever mentioned as an entry point into the Promised Land is the Jordan, it simply doesn't make any sense to conclude that the river mentioned at this verse is the Euphrates, hundreds of miles away, deep into enemy territory. Eventually, Israel's family grew in number so large that it became divided into 12 tribes based on the 12 families of his 12 sons. Jesus would be adopted by Joseph, a man of the tribe of Judah. By the time that Jacob, who became Israel, was born, he would have been part of an enormous family. If you look at a map of all of the land promised to Abraham and compare that to the land that was promised to Israel, it's very easy to see that God was very equitable in his distribution of the land. Seemingly, each of the families that descended from Noah received a portion of land. Jacob's family only being set apart from the other because one of his descendants was to be what in Hebrew is called the Messiah, which in Greek would be called the Christ. But once again, a promise was made. And this time it was going to be to Jacob's son Judah. But this time the promise would be different. At Genesis chapter 49 and verse 10, it says, The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he who possesses peace comes and the people are obedient to him. Many people falsely believe that Jesus would have to have been from the line of kings who descended from Judah. But if you look at what is actually said, it is obvious that members of the ruling family of Israel would only rule until they were replaced by the one possessing peace. Although Jesus was related to the man Judah as well as to King David, his biological lineage was not through Joseph, because Joseph was not his biological father. I'll be explaining the two conflicting lineages of Jesus in part 7 of this series. After the nation of Israel migrated into the Promised Land, the land was divided once again, this time into 12 parts, according to family heads. And even though Judah had died hundreds of years earlier, his descendants would inherit a portion of the land. But once again, Judah's portion was only going to be a small part of what was originally promised to Israel. Please think about what I am saying. After the flood, Noah would have been the recognized ruler of the entire earth. At his death, each of his sons' families would have occupied a portion of that earth, but more important than the land was the leadership of the human family. Shem would have been the recognized father of his family, Ham would have been the recognized father of his family, and Japheth would have been the recognized father of his family. However, without Noah, the human family would have had no family head, no recognized ruler. Without Noah, humanity would no longer function as a single, unified global family, and in fact, as we shall see, that is precisely what happened. As you're about to find out, all of the wars ever fought from the very beginning up until now have been brought about by humanity's inability to perceive itself for what it actually is, a single family. Jesus' father Joseph was born of the tribe of Judah, which possessed only a small portion of the land that had been promised to Israel, roughly 1/12 of that land. When David's father Jesse died, David would have become the individual set to rule over Israel. It was his tribe that would eventually lead to the Messiah. Acts chapter 2 and verse 30 explains something that David was made aware of during his lifetime. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn an oath to him, that of the fruit of his loins, according to the flesh, he would raise up Christ to sit on his throne. It could be said that at that point, King David inherited the entire promised land based on the fact that he was the father of the nation. But according to the Bible, David's entire extended family lived in a very small portion of that land that to this day is known as the city of David. Luke chapter 2 and verse 4 mentions this area of the earth in this way. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. Hopefully you're understanding what I'm saying. As the population grew, each of the men that is mentioned in the Bible as being in line for the inheritance received smaller and smaller portions than their predecessors. By the time that the seed finally arrived, the portion of the land that came with the inheritance was much smaller than the land originally promised to the nation of Israel. As an adopted son, Jesus was not in line to inherit any of the land. At Luke chapter 9 and verse 58, Jesus explained it this way. Foxes have dens, and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Jesus, in fact, was a descendant of David through his mother Mary. However, Jesus was not a descendant of Solomon, who was the next king in line to rule over the land. Mary's ancestor was David's other son, Nathan. After David, no other person ever received the promise that Christ would come from the fruit of their loins until the angel Gabriel announced to Mary that she had been chosen to give birth to Jesus. Currently, earthwide, a struggle is going on over control of this small area of the earth as if this land is the most significant spot on the planet. According to the Bible, it isn't the land that we are supposed to concern ourselves with. It is and always has been the seed. That seed being Jesus. When Jesus was alive, he ruled over none of the land. In Matthew chapter 4 and verses 1 through 10, we are told that the ruler of the world approached Jesus with an offer that many would have greedily accepted. Then was Jesus led up on the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. And he said to him, all these I will give you if you fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. It should be obvious that the promise was never about that particular piece of land. From the very beginning, the promise was about Jesus. Since this family line began at Adam's creation and continued all the way to Jesus nearly 4,000 years later, someone might wonder who the seed would be today. Just as Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16 says, our seed is Jesus. The Greek word used here is Sal, Strong's G4771. There is no denying that the word Sal can only be translated as your. It is unlikely that you will find an English Bible that has the word your as part of the text, but it is there in every ancient manuscript of this verse, which of course is easy enough to confirm via the internet. If we look at each and every person on the list, there isn't any ambiguity about how they came to possess the inheritance. They all descended genetically from the previous person on the list. None of those on the list were nephews of the previous person on the list. None were adopted sons. And as is the case with Canaan, Ishmael, and Lot, none were what we today would call illegitimate sons. If the line of descent had continued, the Bible would have recorded the name of each of those next in line for the inheritance, but it doesn't. When Paul referred to Jesus as your seed, he was doing so long after Jesus' death. If Jesus had an heir, Paul would have referred to Jesus' legal heir as your seed. In our day, there are quite a few theories regarding the parts of Jesus' life that are not recorded in the Bible. Many of those theories address his relationship with the women that followed him, as if it is impossible for a man to interact with women without producing children. Obviously, as a man, Jesus would have had all of the same emotions and sexual desires that any healthy, natural man would have had. But since none of that is discussed in the Bible, we can rest assured that the details of Jesus' sex life would not add to or understanding of anything in any significant way. There is nothing in the Bible about Jesus having children or Jesus not having children. But since Paul specifically referred to Jesus as your seed years after his death, it should be obvious that the right of inheritance ended with Jesus' death. But even if Jesus had children, they would not have inherited anything. According to the pattern set in the Bible, any inheritance that Jesus would have gotten would have come through the line of Joseph. Joseph was not Jesus' father. Jesus was adopted. In John chapter 12 and verse 24, Jesus himself actually describes another aspect of why he is referred to as the seed and why he is the only man who has ever lived that could rightfully be called the seed. Truly, truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a seed. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. As the only human being who has ever died and been permanently resurrected from the dead to everlasting life, only Jesus has experienced what John chapter 12 and verse 24 describes. As 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 20 says, but now Christ is risen from the dead and has become the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. Some Bibles render this verse as Christ is the first of a great harvest of all who have died, thus preserving the concept of planting seeds and reaping a harvest from those planted seeds. As the verse says, he is the firstfruits of the harvest, confirming that there would eventually be others, meaning that everyone who has ever lived can experience a resurrection similar to that experienced by Jesus. Over the years, many have speculated about the identity of Melchizedek. Some religions teach that Melchizedek is Jesus himself. Certainly, he could be called the King of Righteousness. And now that we understand that the actual title is rightful king, the association between Jesus and Melchizedek is even more profound. A strong Jewish tradition exists that Melchizedek was Shem, the son of Noah. Obviously, he is on the list of Abraham's ancestors and is specifically spoken of as having a unique relationship with his God Yahweh that his brothers did not have. It is also undeniable that Shem would have still been alive when Abram met with Melchizedek. According to the Bible, all religions are under the direct control of God's enemy, Satan. This information can be found at 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4. That doesn't mean that they never tell the truth. Religions often teach some truth as a means of tricking good people into joining their ranks. At John chapter 8 and verse 44, Jesus said that Satan had no truth in him because he was a liar from the very beginning. And yet 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 14 says that Satan masquerades as an angel of light. It could be possible that one of the religions is telling the truth about the identity of Melchizedek. But unless he is both Shem and Jesus, at least one is teaching lies. And since neither Judaism nor Christianity has a very good reputation for truth, the most likely scenario is that both are lying. Just knowing that there are mainstream religions teaching that Melchizedek is Jesus or that Melchizedek is Shem almost guarantees that he is neither. The very first king mentioned after the flood was Nimrod. Since Nimrod's name was not mentioned among the kings invading the land from Shinar, the possibility does exist that Nimrod was Melchizedek. May not sound right, but at this point we really need to be aware of all of our options. Another possibility that exists is that one of Noah's other legitimate sons is Melchizedek. After all, if Shem was still alive, it is likely that his brothers were still alive as well. Even though it is obvious that Shem stands out from the others, we cannot automatically eliminate Ham or Japheth. There are several other significant Bible personalities that would have been alive at the time but could not have been Melchizedek due to simple logic. God himself could not have been Melchizedek because Melchizedek is spoken of as a priest of God. Abraham could not have been Melchizedek because he is said to have paid tithes to Melchizedek. Neither Sarah nor any other woman could have been Melchizedek because Melchizedek is referred to by male gender words. I have tried my best to describe every major character in the Bible that was alive at the time in order to determine the identity of Melchizedek, but there is always the possibility that Melchizedek was not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. At this point, we have to consider every possibility. Even if we know with all our hearts who Melchizedek is, we need to prove to ourselves that there is no possibility that he could be someone else. If you are a religious person, what I am about to reveal to you is going to sound preposterous. But if you are open-minded and willing to hear me out, you will be surprised at just how logical what I am going to tell you actually is. Although I am going to finish out this video by exposing the true identity of Melchizedek using nothing more than one simple verse, pointing out one simple, basic, undeniable fact, I promise you that I will be sharing much more information on this subject in the remainder of the videos in this series. And when I am done, you will know in your heart that I am right. You will know who Melchizedek is. You will know more about the Bible than anybody, anywhere, in any of civilization's religions. If you speak publicly about what I am about to reveal to you, you can expect to be ridiculed and abused by those who belong to Satan's cults. Choose who you speak with about these things carefully. Abraham spent his time in the Promised Land as what the Bible calls a maguer, Strong's H4033. This ancient Hebrew word is rendered as stranger in the King James Version of the Bible. The NIV renders this word as foreigner. The NWT renders it as alien resident. The point being that Abraham was never a citizen of the land that he entered. At Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1, it is revealed to us that God commanded Abram to leave his father's house and travel to a land that he would show him. As worded, this verse does not reveal any details as to where Abram would be going, but at the historical account found at Genesis chapter 11 and verse 31, we are told, they went forth from Ur of the Chaldees to go to the land of Canaan. Most of us has heard this story so many times that we never stop to think about what it means. When Abram entered the Promised Land, he did so as an alien, traveling from his home of Ur into the land of Canaan. His home was not just listed by name, but according to the people that it belonged to, Ur of the Chaldeans. The Hebrew word that is here rendered as Chaldee, or in some Bibles as Chaldeans, actually means clod breakers. A clod breaker would be someone that breaks up the ground. Since the Babylonian Empire was known for building with bricks and bitumen, and also for relying on agriculture, clod breaker would be a very good description of the people that occupied the Chaldean Empire. The point being that Abraham did not simply come from Ur, he came from Ur of the Chaldeans. And the description of the land that God would show him was just as detailed as the description of his home. The land of Canaan. Quite literally, Canaan's land. This is the location where the meeting between Abram, the foreigner, and Melchizedek, the rightful king, took place. If Abram of Ur was a foreigner because he was a Chaldean, then it's only logical to conclude that Melchizedek, the rightful king, was not a foreigner. Since the meeting took place in Canaan's land, it's only logical to conclude that the rightful king of Canaan's land would have been Cainan. Canaan's older brother Shem was still alive. It should be obvious that Cainan would also still be alive. It is a provable fact that Cainan was born no earlier than 1656 a.m. If Cainan lived as long as his contemporary Shem and Arphaxad, he would have likely died sometimes between 2094 and 2266 a.m., meaning that we have no reason to imagine that Cainan was not still alive when the meeting between Abram and Melchizedek took place sometime after 2023 a.m. Think about what that means. If Melchizedek was Shem or Jesus, why doesn't the Bible refer to the area of the earth over which Melchizedek ruled as the land of Shem, or the land of Jesus, or simply as the land of Melchizedek? Psalms chapter 110 begins with the words, Jehovah says to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Very powerful words, obviously said by God to Jesus, which eventually is confirmed in the book of Hebrews. The psalm continues at verse 4 with the words, Yahweh has sworn, and he will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. When this verse was written, it is likely that no one had any idea of how this prophecy would play out. Nearly 1,000 years later, Jesus was born, and yet no one was able to understand how this birth could have anything to do with the fulfillment of this prophecy. But years after Jesus' death, a book was produced and given to mankind, fully explaining the words of Psalms 110 so that we today can know and understand just why Canaan's role was so important. That book is known today as the book of Hebrews. According to 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 10, the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim were destroyed for despising authority, or as other versions of the Bible say, scoffing at supernatural beings, or blaspheming glorious ones. Obviously, the glorious ones that they were despising were Melchizedek, their oldest living ancestor, and Melchizedek's God, the creator of natural law. The Bible clearly states that all of the kings of the promised land were sons of Canaan. By refusing to be obedient to Melchizedek, they were breaking the commandment to honor their father. Genesis chapter 10 and verses 15 through 19 clearly states that all of the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, and the others that God killed with the fire and brimstone were descendants of Canaan. Before I go on, I need to tell you something that I stumbled upon as I was producing this series. As many of you know, I don't just learn about the Bible from reading the Bible. There are many ancient books about the origins and history of man other than the Bible. Many of the details recorded in those ancient books contradict the details recorded in the books of the Bible, but often those details can be used to confirm the things that may not be clearly explained using the Bible alone. The Holy Quran says that Noah had a fourth son that refused to enter the ark and died as a result. Some versions name this fourth son as Cainan. Another ancient book containing a midrash called Chapter of Rabbi Eliezer simply records that Cainan was Noah's fourth son, and that it was he who discovered Noah naked and castrated him with a string. Ham saw that Cainan had castrated Noah and went to the market laughing about it. Obviously, there is no way for us to confirm all three versions of the story of Cainan. However, the two versions outside of the Bible narrative do agree with the ancient Hebrew copies of the book of Genesis that Cainan was in fact the name of Noah's fourth son. When we hear something that goes completely against everything that we have ever been taught, we need that teaching to be based on much more than a couple of scriptures. After all, every lie taught by the churches can be supported by a couple of scriptures. And we certainly don't want the foundation of our faith to be as precarious as that of Satan's cults. Abraham and his seed are very important to the Bible narrative. And yet, according to Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 2, it was he who paid tithes to Melchizedek and not the other way around. In part 5 of this video series, we will be closely examining every verse in the Bible specifically about Melchizedek. In the meantime, the next video in this series will be about a group of beings that in many Bibles are described as giants. Some Bibles call them Nephilim. The information that I will be revealing in part 4 of this series will positively identify who these mysterious beings are for the first time in thousands of years. In accordance with God's law to honor our father and mother, both Adam and Noah would have been the recognized fathers of everyone alive during their lifetimes. At Adam's death, Seth would have become the recognized replacement for Adam. In effect, the rightful king. At Noah's death, his son Cainan would have become the recognized replacement for his father Noah. In effect, the rightful king, the Melchizedek. As mysterious as Melchizedek's identity might be to the members of the varying sects of man, it need not be mysterious to us. Abraham's seed would eventually lead to Jesus, a king and priest in the order of Melchizedek. If you don't want to survive, don't listen to me.